Fashion is subjective to the eye of the beholder, but some choices throughout history have made more than a couple of modern folks scratch their head. Ranging from codpieces to panniers, bloomer suits and more, today we're breaking down some choices made throughout history. For starters, codpieces began with a logical explanation. Men's hose back then were two pieces, one for each leg, tied together at the top. Now when men's jackets came down to their thighs and further, everything was covered. Then came tight-fitting doublets, raising men's jackets to their hips and higher, so then all that genitalia was exposed, and enter the codpiece. Pretty quickly, these became statements of power. They were embroidered, bejeweled, shaped, and stuffed. A portrait of Henry VIII of England is a noted example of this top dog studliness. Some also say that the codpiece served as a form of protection against rampant syphilis during that time period. Now the term cod is a Middle English word meaning scrotum, but French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wasn't having it, calling out the hypocrisy of the device. In the 1580s, he deemed the codpiece an empty and useless model of a member that we cannot even decently mention by name, which however we show off and parade in public. Outside of places like Ren fairs, medieval times, they're not as common anymore as doublet styles changed and breeches became more billowing, but you gotta give a special shout out to when Christian Borle rocked one in Something Rotten as William Shakespeare, because I totally remember when that broke the musical theater internet community for a moment. Panniers, from the French word meaning basket, were super popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. The boxed petticoat expanded the width of skirts and dresses and stood out on either side of the waistline. These varied in size and were made of whalebone, wood, metal, and sometimes reeds. Extremely large panniers were worn mostly on special occasions and reflected the wearer's social status. Now, for contrast, servants wore smaller hoops. There was actually one point where noblewomen, there was two of them, they couldn't walk through an entrance at the same time or even sit on a couch together. The device was also kind of uncomfortable, limiting movement and activity. The very expansive panniers sparked a lot of ridicule. A satirical article in the Gentleman's Magazine, written in 1750, portrayed women as being sick of the burden of the style. We pass along, as it were, balancing between two scales. Every person we meet, every post we pass, and every corner we turn, encumber our way and obstruct our progress. We fit in a chair, hid up to our very ears on either side, like a swan with her head between her lifted wings. The whole side of a coach is hardly spacious enough for one of us. So hoop skirts are still worn occasionally today to fill up ball gowns, and it can still be a doozy to fit through tiny doorways. Thankfully, it's not as big as a pannier, and modern ones are pretty squishy if you need to scoop them up. But let's say if you were to combine a crazy big hoop with a corset and wings for like a fantasy-themed outfit, just get dressed outside or in the room you need to be in, or else you're gonna accidentally bop somebody with your out there fashion choices. Bombasting, or padding one's clothing with extra stuffing, became super popular during the Elizabethan era in Britain. So at the time, both men and women were known to bombast their sleeves to create the gigantic leg of mutton poofs that we now associate with that time period. Men would also bombast their doublets to create the appearance of a filled out belly. So a man's Elizabethan doublet can include as much as 4 to 6 pounds of bombast, made from rags, cotton, horsehair, or bran. While this sort of fell out of fashion in the mid-17th century, padding one's perceived deficiencies never truly went out of style. Turns out during the Regency era, men continued to stuff their clothes in order to achieve the ideal silhouette. In that case though, apparently the stuffing was primarily in the pants. Especially the calves. Now, I imagine the famous lake scene in the 1995 BBC version of Pride and Prejudice would have been less revered had Colin Firth's Darcy been shown removing calf padding and a girdle before diving in. Oh, and those leg of mutton sleeves made a whole resurgence at the end of the 19th century. Just ask Anne Shirley about her love of them. Today, people are more likely to pad their bosoms or derrieres than their legs or arms or stomach. Are modern day high heels or platforms just not high enough for you? Well, in the 19th century, some of the folks in France incorporated stilts into their daily ensembles. Chongs, or big legs, were created by shepherds to help navigate the brushy, swampy terrain. High atop the stilts, the shepherds could wade through pools of water and quickly scale the countryside without bothering to look for roads, which were few and far between. An 1891 article in Scientific American described the stilts as pieces of wood about 5 feet in length, provided with a shoulder and strap to support the foot. The upper part of the wood is flattened and rests against the leg, where it is held by a strong strap. The lower part, that which rests upon the earth, is enlarged and sometimes strengthened with a sheep's bone. Now the shepherd is provided with a staff, which he uses for numerous purposes, such as a point of support for getting onto the stilts, and as a crook for directing his flocks. But these weren't just reserved for the shepherds. We're talking all the villagers, men, women, young folks, all skilled stilt walkers. you can make a circus out of them. During the roaring 20s, fashion trends began to favor a rectangular boyish figure over an hourglass form, and underthings got an overhaul. The goal of every garment was to flatten the torso, so that flapper dresses could hang straight down without any curvaceous interruptions. To achieve this straighter silhouette, women enlisted the help of some newfangled undergarments. Specifically, the Symington side lacer, invented by corset makers R and W.H. Symington, was a type of bra designed specifically to flatten rather than support your top part. The wearer would slip the garment over their head, then pull the straps and side laces tight to smooth out any curves. Now, I wouldn't say this style of silhouette has gone completely by the wayside today, since sports bras to an extent are also used to support and restrain certain elements of the body. Also, with the rise of binders in fashion and practicality, used to bind for a flatter figure, I'd imagine they are sort of a spiritual, if not direct descendant of the side lacer, even though sadly I couldn't find any research to support that. Lotus shoes were worn by Chinese girls with bound feet. So for centuries, families repeatedly broke and folded the feet of their young daughters to create the tiny feet that were the epitome of femininity. This foot was bound with long ribbons to prevent growth, and if the toes withered and fell off, even better! Now this process usually took between 2 to 3 years, and then your feet are kinda tiny for the rest of your life. If your feet were bound, you'd wear lotus shoes, which are cone or sheath-shaped footwear that would resemble a lotus bud. These shoes are made of silk or cotton and were usually pretty ornate, embroidered with flowers, animals, and other traditional patterns. There were a lot of attempts to ban foot binding throughout history. It was finally officially outlawed in 1912, but the practice was still carried out in secret in some areas of China for years after. I'm sure by this point everybody is super aware that Victorian ladies really overdid it on using arsenic in their beauty regimens, but I'm here to tell you it also carried over to their garments as well. Bottle green dresses were all the rage in the Victorian era, and they had the price tags to match. To achieve this lovely shade of green, the fabric was dyed using large amounts of arsenic. Some women suffered nausea, impaired vision, and skin reactions to the dye, but the dresses were only worn on special occasions, so it limited the exposure to the arsenic in the fabric. So yeah, it wasn't as gnarly as like eating arsenic wafers or using belladonna eye drops, but still not ideal for one's health, especially if they were paired with any kind of shapewear garment, such as stays or a corset that would restrict your breathing. At the end of the day though, the garment makers were the real sufferers. A lot of folks died to bring this trend to the fashion stays of the world. Super stiff detachable collars were super popular in the 19th century, and they could be deadly. Starched to the point of being nearly unbendable and attached with a singular or pair of studs, the collars could slowly asphyxiate a man, particularly if he fell asleep or passed out while drinking. Another dangerous aspect of the collar was its pointed corners. A St. Louis man tripped in the street, and the pointed corners of the collar actually jabbed into his throat, making 2 ugly gashes. So these collars were so lethal, they were actually known as the father killer. Happy belated Father's Day, folks. Moving on! Newspaper editor and temperance advocate Amelia Bloom helped start a wave of more practical, less constricting clothing for women in the 1850s. So her newspaper, The Lily, became the place where she and writer and activist Elizabeth Smith Miller promoted the bloomer suit. Consisting of trousers under a knee-length skirt with a vest, this suit caught on with temperance activists and other like-minded women, causing a major sensation. So women who wore these suits were frequently harassed because this outfit was deemed scandalous. Many in the press and society lamented that the suit robbed a woman of her mystery by revealing too much. So the suit was eventually ridiculed back into the closet, but not before making a mark on fashion. Look, the only issue I see with this style of fashion is how annoying it would be to wrestle a skirt on over a pair of trousers. Also revealing too much? This is where it's fun comparing retro fashion to current fashion, because nowadays if somebody were to wear that in say crazy hot weather, people would be like, why are you wearing so much? And finally for today, it's no coincidence that the rise of wig making and wearing corresponded with the late 16th century syphilis outbreak. In the Middle Ages, long hair denoted wealth and high social status for both men and women, because only the rich could go about their days unhindered by their flowing locks. So the more follically challenged members of the upper and middle classes, predominantly those with those nasty diseases, took to wearing horse, goat, or human hair wigs, known as perruques. They were coated with scented lavender or orange powder to mask the inevitable gnarly smells symptomatic of syphilis. But the trend turned from necessity to the height of fashion when France's King Louis began wearing wigs. Well, he was balding from a young age. And because of that, he hired 48 wig makers to keep his bare scalp well covered. Now when his cousin, Charles II, started wearing wigs to hide his mop, the fad became a sensation. Powdered wigs were the look du jour until the late 18th century, when the French Revolution and a tax on hair powder caused citizens to be like, no more. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.